Hi everyone, and welcome to Cloud Coffee Break with me, Mike Roberts. Hello, here I am. In this series, I'm going to help you learn more about serverless and cloud computing, all in bite-sized videos about the length it takes to drink a decent mug of coffee. Now, 2020 has been a tough year, and I know it's a small thing, but I miss getting to conferences and meetups and chatting with people about the kind of stuff that I do in my day-to-day work. And so this series, frankly, is something of an experiment to try to bring a little bit of that back. Obviously, most of it's going to be this way, but hopefully I'll get some questions and feedback back from all of you as well. I am half of a consulting company named Symphonia, along with my business partner, John Chapin. And we help people out with cloud strategy, architecture, engineering, and operations. And if you have questions for future episodes or you're interested in my work, then please drop me a line or follow me on Twitter. A lot of the work that we do includes the use of serverless techniques, and a lot of this series is going to be about serverless. And so it feels appropriate to kick off with the question that many people have: what is serverless? Well, I've been using serverless now for nearly 5 years. And in fact, 3 years ago, I wrote a book with my business partner, John, along with O'Reilly. And you can download this book from our website. It's actually a small, thin ebook that is free. Now, one way to think about this question, what is serverless, is actually to start with the opposite question. What is a server? Now, what initially comes to mind to you probably depends a little bit on your day-to-day work. For example, it might be that when you think about a server, you think of a physical rack-mounted machine full of hard disks and microprocessors and network cards and memory. Or it might be something like a virtual machine running on the cloud, something like EC2. Perhaps, though, it's something like a Kubernetes cluster or a node within a Kubernetes cluster. But it might be none of these. It might actually be an application server if you're more on the software engineering side. So something like Node Express that you start and it listens, waiting for requests coming from the outside world. But when we think about all of these things, the answer, of course, is that what is a server? Well, it's all of these. And why is it? Why can these things, from physical hardware through to an application server, why do we think of all of those things as being a server? What is common? Well, when you think of servers, you probably think of things like provisioning and lifecycle and network connections and instances and capacity and high availability, all of those kind of things. However, when you think serverless, you don't think of any of those things at all. In fact, when you're thinking serverless, what it happens is that serverless means just using services that handle all the server traits necessary to run systems, leaving you to focus on the needs of the application. Now, of course, there are still servers somewhere, but it is no longer your responsibility to think about all of those elements like provisioning and lifecycle. That becomes the providers of the services' responsibility. On AWS, serverless includes services like DynamoDB, S3, Lambda, API Gateway, and SNS. And many others as well. These are just a sort of small smattering of serverless services on AWS. But of course, when a lot of people think about serverless on AWS, they're thinking about Lambda, Amazon's functions as a service platform. But really, Lambda is just a small part of building a serverless application. Now, in this series, I'm mostly, but not exclusively, going to be talking about serverless. And that's because I think over the next 5 years, that's where most of us are heading. 10 years ago, at the birth of the cloud, most folk were thinking about managing virtual machines, but now that's fairly unusual, for new applications at least. In the same way, I think the cloud is going to continue to evolve, and my bet is largely it's going to evolve away from explicit container application approaches and more towards ones that are geared around serverless services. Also in this series, I'm mostly going to talk about AWS, since that's what I know best. But most of what I talk about should be mappable to other cloud providers as well. I'm not an expert in Google or Azure or the other ones, so for now, I'm just going to stick with AWS because that's what I know. Okay, let's move on to something else. One of the aspects of this series that I'm really excited about is getting to grips with actual code and actual tech. And I'm going to give an example today. And today's example is very much for beginners, but I look forward to getting into some complicated ideas as well. So back in 2016, which was really when I first started digging heavily into serverless technologies, when you were getting started with serverless, the initial experience was not awesome, I have to say. There are a lot of complex command line incantations, lots of configuration files, and strange templating requirements if you were using some services, and a whole bunch of other things besides. Now, it's 2020 now, as we all know, but it's 4.5 years later, and the experience for Hello World is actually a heck of a lot better, thank goodness. And in fact, creating a Hello World serverless app takes less than 5 minutes. I know, it's shocking, but I'm going to show you how. So the example I'm going to build is a public HTTP endpoint, and this is really the Hello World of cloud computing. Now, using just AWS tools, this can now be built and deployed with one short file and one simple terminal command. Now, we're going to use two AWS services to make this happen. API Gateway, which is the purple icon here, and AWS Lambda, which is the orange one. Now, I did say 5 minutes. Well, it's 5 minutes if you already have a few prerequisites set up. And if you need any more details on these prerequisites, then please see the resource page for this talk, which I link here and you can go to afterwards. So the prerequisites are, first of all, you need the credentials to an AWS account with sufficiently high privileges. Ideally, you'll have some kind of development account with admin access. You also need to have the AWS command line tool, or CLI, installed and have it configured to use those credentials that we set up in the previous step. And finally, you need to have another tool called the AWS SAM CLI installed. So I'm doing all of this stuff using the terminal, the command line. You can do this also via the web console, or in fact, even via IDEs these days. A few IDEs have explicit AWS plugins which will do some of this work for you. But with all these prerequisites in place, let's build and deploy a serverless app. So first create a new directory and change into it, and then create a file in there called template.yaml, or copy the file from the resources link that I showed in the previous slide. Now, this is a CloudFormation template. It uses the AWS Serverless Application Model, or SAM, macro. We define that our application consists of one SAM resource, a serverless Lambda function. Now, all Lambda functions are triggered by an event. In our case, we want that event to be something making a request to a public HTTP endpoint. Now, this particular events property defines this and will configure our API gateway resource implicitly. All Lambda functions have code, of course, and Lambda has a very simple programming model. simple enough that for small cases, you can even inline the code in the deployment template that we have here. Now, it's rare that you're going to do this in production, and it may never be that you do this in production, but this is kind of handy for very, very small applications or demos like this one. And finally, we define a couple of configuration options to point to our Lambda code and state which language runtime we want to run our Lambda function in. So that's our application's source code. How do we build and deploy it? Well, with the AWS SAM CLI, this is much more simple than it was a few years ago. Running SAM deploy -- guided is great for beginners since it guides you through the necessary deployment options and then saves these choices to a local file for future redeployments. So the only question you need to answer when you're going through the guided approach, other than the default answer, is where it asks something along the lines of, hello world function may not have authorization defined. Is this okay? And that's the one where you need to explicitly type yes and then hit enter. Now, once SAM deploy has completed successfully, we can run our app. But in order to do this, we need to know where it's deployed to. To do that, you need to go to the API Gateway console within the AWS console. You can also do this through the terminal, but it's easier to show you via the web console for this example. If you don't see your API listed in the list on the API Gateway console, make sure that the region that you have selected, top right, is the same region that you're using in your terminal. Okay, so assuming that you can see it, click into your API, and you should be able to find the invoke URL, which is down towards the bottom. Now, if you click onto that invoke URL, it will actually invoke your application, and you should see something like this. If you can, you're successful. Congratulations. You have now deployed your first serverless application. Now, just to prove it to yourself, you might want to change what's in the message, in the template, and then redeploy. And you can just run SAM deploy this time. You don't need to use -- guided because the options will have been saved. Once the redeployment has completed, you can go back to this same URL, refresh the page, and you should see your new message. So this is an application that's available to the entire global public internet. And so you probably want to tear it down when you're done. To do that, you can run this command using the AWS CLI. So AWS CloudFormation delete stack, and then you specify the name of your stack, which if you use the default from the SAM CLI, it will be sam-app. Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for this first episode. What I covered today was a very, very, very brief introduction to what serverless is, and as I mentioned, you can download our ebook if you want to read more on that. And I also showed you the hello world of serverless applications and showed how you could deploy and run a serverless app on AWS in about 5 minutes. There are a bunch of resources for this talk. If you go to this link, it will include links to the video and the slides, as well as a much more thorough description of the prerequisites for setting up your AWS credentials, as well as the more sort of detailed step-by-step detail of how you can run the serverless Hello World application. And of course, make sure to follow me on Twitter so you can see when I release the next episode of this. And I'll see you next time. Bye.